Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Big drama ahead of the Montreal Grand Prix as Derek Warwick, one of the chief stewards, has turned up to Canada this weekend, only to be told that he will not be stewarding the weekend. Instead, somebody else is going to be stepping in remotely after he's been suspended just for this Grand Prix after a similar transgression to what Johnny Herbert, it seems, got fired for last year. Speaking to the media over the last few days, the FIA have decided this was out of line for Derek Warwick, and more FIA stewarding related drama going into the weekend. Is this a fair punishment, all things considered? What exactly did he say? And exactly what are the circumstances around why this has happened and whether this was the correct decision. Going into qualifying, who's going to stick it on pole? Very much into your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. Let's get straight into it. Another day when I'm going to try and do two videos here. One this morning before I go to the track for practice in quali, and then hopefully one afterwards. I would love to do a pre-show or something, but I'm not sure how possible that's going to be. Like, I might be on my phone at the track or something. I might run out of battery. I don't know. I'll see what happens when we get to the circuit today. But there's plenty to talk about this morning before we even get to the track. So just quickly on Ferrari, there's been lots of debate overnight. What's actually happening there? Is Fred Vasseur going to get fired? Like, what's the situation? There's now more reports that this situation is increasingly tense. Vasseur's future is under real scrutiny. We talked about many of these quotes yesterday. Of course, the weekend's gone from bad to worse in many respects because Charles Leclerc crashed it in practice. That didn't set themselves up for success at all for the rest of the weekends. And obviously he's set himself back as well quite substantially, and Hamilton was not exactly rapid, although the Ferrari showed some signs of promise, but it's not been great around here for the last few years. Vasseur, though, was very attacking in his response. We talked about it yesterday. Of course, lots of his attacks were towards the media, the way that they put pressure on the people in the team rather than things, as he says. And also, he was joking in the press conferences. I think there was talk about the new F1 film, and he was saying, look, well, I'm looking for a new job. Kind of tongue-in-cheek, I would think. But I think the conclusion that I would draw is that the way that Vasseur is speaking right now sounds either like someone who is completely secure in his job, 100% guaranteed not going anywhere. Certainly when you understand the politics and the way that things are at Ferrari, there's one of two ways to read the way that Vasseur is talking. He's been so aggressive in his responses, saying how there are questions on why Ferrari can't win. We've changed the TP, we've changed the drivers, we've changed everything except for one thing. Now, of course, this opens up to a barrage of jokes or interpretations as to what he might be saying. I think what Vasseur's talking about is the structure, the way that Ferrari as a sports car brand are involved in the Formula 1 team, and on some level, I think Vasseur is criticising the likes of a John Alcan, the likes of a Benedetta Vigna, right? Or maybe not those individuals, but certainly the structure that gives rise to the existence of those individuals and how the Ferrari setup actually works and the involvement of the politics in the space. Vasseur surely can only say this if he is either the most secure man on the planet in his job or he knows he's getting sacked. I don't really see, there's not too many other ways to read it, really. And the more I think about it, the more, concerned I am that this actually is the conclusion to draw. Because De Keyser, we talked about this quite yesterday, but if you guys didn't see last night's video, was saying how after listening to Fred Vasseur talk about the situation, he doesn't think he's going to keep the job. And, there's been lots of Ferrari fans giving comments on, social media today to say that, look, as far as they're concerned from, their read on the situation is, and okay, this is just kind of a fan opinion, but their read on it is that, yeah, it's likely this is true. And I think my read on it is that as well, because, as I say, I look at what Vasseur is saying and I'm like, either he's 100% confident that he's keeping his job, which seems doubtful at best, or he's pretty convinced he's getting canned and therefore he's going to go down swinging, which would be, both ways it's Ferrari at its best. Certainly this latter one, I suppose. But that's the Ferrari update of the day. Probably more to come. We'll talk quickly about practice yesterday and what it means for today. Of course, the Mercedes looked pretty good. It seems like the new upgrade did produce more downforce, and FP1 comparisons are made between the old and the new rear axle. Both cars used the new version in the afternoon session, which is certainly a vote of confidence in the changes they have made. Still unclear whether the tyres stayed in the ideal temperature range during race pace due to the mild weather or the updated mechanical parts. Maybe a bit of both. So, there is an intention the Mercedes bring these upgrades to make their tyres not so sensitive to the fluctuations in temperature that we know that this Mercedes still suffers with. It was not chilly yesterday in Montreal, but it wasn't exactly, boiling hot. It will likely be warm for the rest of the weekend, which could affect Mercedes certainly on Sunday. But I think in qualifying today, they should still be rather confident. Now, Russell played down much. He said, look, the lap that I put in there was nothing more in the tank than that. That was as good as I could do. But to be fair, when Russell put that lap time in, he was like 6 tenths up on anybody else, and it stayed the fastest lap time. When Norris set his lap towards the end of the session, which is very close, the track was more rubbered in, right? Like, there were better track conditions when Lando set the lap time later on than when George did. So, you could argue that lap from George was still really, really impressive. And he says there was nothing more to give. That simply was what it was, and the car, that's the speed of the car. But that was still pretty damn speedy, right? So at the end of the session, he ends up ahead by 300ths over Lando. Antonelli was 3 tenths back. Then Albon, Alonso, Piastri, Sainz, Hamilton, Verstappen, Lawson. We talked about some of these numbers, of course, yesterday. On the other side of the garage, though, or at least on the other side of the Mercedes-powered teams, it was an interesting day for McLaren. AMUS did another article actually describing how around this circuit right now, the McLarens are very strong in the corners. But on this specific track, it does seem like they're losing quite a lot on the straights compared to their rivals, more so than you would expect otherwise. Now, we know that McLaren, they're probably not running the highest engine modes, are they? Let's be real. They may do in practice today. I think FP3 is going to be interesting because usually they push pretty hard on FP3, McLaren. So whether that comes true again today, I guess we will see. But their top speed was pretty lackluster in a straight line, which is not unusual. There's been lots of talk about how McLaren's packaging of the brakes that's given them the advantage they have has the consequence of giving them more drag. It's simply a trade-off that they have made. And, there's no free lunches really in the world of Formula One. If you're going to do something, then it's going to have a consequence. And it seems that McLaren's strategy on the brake cooling and the way that they're managing the airflow does have consequences for the drag on the machine. And it does mean that in terms of straight line speed, they're pretty much the slowest on the grid. But if you're leading, that's usually fine. You have clean air, you can stretch your advantage, and there's no beating you. But if you're not, then it becomes a bit more of a challenge. We know that Norris, and Piastri have not always had the easiest time just carving their way through the field. So anyway, Norris yesterday called it the worst Friday so far, but at the end of the day, they weren't far off the pace. It doesn't seem like McLaren, though, were ultra confident that everything they tried yesterday was really going to plan, and it feels right now that the straight line speed that McLaren have a disadvantage of around this specific circuit with the setup that they've gone for yesterday, it was costing them a lot, and maybe too much even, to secure pole today. We shall see. Hamilton, it's very, very unlikely that he can get pole, nor Charles Leclerc. The car didn't really seem to be there. He says, look, the day wasn't great. The car's a bit, a lot different, he says, to what I've experienced in the past. Everyone was all right. But apart from that, everything just pretty much got slower. Trying to fight to get into the top 5 is going to be tough, he says, going into this day on the Saturday. Not a great vote of confidence for Ferrari, especially because Hamilton loves this track. He's so good at it. And he's not very happy with the car around here. And Charles Leclerc didn't even get time to practice yesterday because he crashed it. So, things at Ferrari go from bad to worse. But in many respects, maybe so do things at the FIA. Lots of drama about the FIA, Ben Sulayem, all of that stuff as of late. Derek Warwick, a controversial character in the stewarding world for many a reason, comments he made back in the day, the whole Honda dealership thing and the relationships that might mean. But he was in Formula One, he drove in Formula One for nigh on a decade or something like that. So, certainly a notable character. And he's been a steward for quite some time and has been one of the more notable ones. He turned up to Canada, I think, this weekend and has been suspended from stewarding. So he's not going to be in the stewards room this weekend. They're bringing in somebody else instead remotely, Enrique Bernoldi, as you can see here. But the FIA say, following recent unauthorised media comments, the FIA has taken the decision to suspend Derek Warwick from his duties as driver steward for this weekend's Canadian Grand Prix. After discussion, Derek acknowledges that his comments were ill-advised in his role as an FIA steward and has apologised. Derek will resume his duties as a steward in the forthcoming Austrian Grand Prix. So, Derek's not there every weekend. The stewards rotate, which is controversial and probably just straight up flawed, to be perfectly honest. But that is the way that it is. But he's back. He's going to get suspended for a weekend, and then he's back in business again. Now, this is controversial just because of what happens before to Johnny Herbert, and we'll get into that in a second. Now, Warwick gave plenty of comments, and I think it's the manner in which these comments were circulated that caused a lot of the controversy. Now, his main comment that he made, really, was about the penalty that Max got. He said the penalty was justified, but he didn't think that it was intentional that Max collided into George. So he actually defended the steward. He said it was absolutely wrong and the FIA was right to give him a penalty. So he gave those comments. Now let's not forget here, Johnny Herbert, man on the left-hand side, he also used to be a steward. Now he was involved in Sky F1, and there were other elements that he was involved with as well, which made, there were questions on whether he should really be a steward or not. But he made comments last year about Max Verstappen, right, and saying that Max was over the top the way that he drove in Mexico, that his driving frustrates him massively. He's got this horrible mindset of trying to gain an advantage by taking a fellow driver off the racetrack and all this. So he made these comments last year, and he was sacked for it, basically, because the FIA said at the time that there was an incompatibility between his duties as a steward and that of a media pundit. So we fast forward to the present day, and Derek Warwick has made similar comments, actually in a very similar way. Maybe his comments weren't as aggressive, but he definitely made some comments to, a gambling site. And we'll see kind of how that plays into this in a second and exactly the dynamics of why the FIA are not happy about this. But according to Autosport, this is a bigger drama than initially it seems. He's made several unauthorized comments. Some quotes attributed to Warwick circulated by a gambling firm have been picked up by a number of websites, including apparently other comment on Lando, on Stroll, on Yuki, comments that apparently are even more, widespread than we are going to talk about in this video, because mainly the comments that people are talking about here are around Lewis Hamilton and also Max Verstappen, and we'll get to that right about now. This was the Hamilton comment that he made, and maybe this was the one that was deemed more problematic, because the Max Verstappen-Russell incident, he said, look, the stewards did the right thing. It's basically what he said. And yeah, he was critical of Max, or he actually kind of defended Max. He was critical, but also he defended him and saying that he didn't do it intentionally, whatever. I suspect he's already thinking of stopping, Warwick said on Hamilton, but he also said that I think he deserves the 8th world title, but it's not going to happen this year. So, it's just the idea of a steward saying that a driver deserves a title. Like, I think, whatever you think about the Max comments and what Warwick has said in the past or done in the past or whatever, the comments from a steward to say, oh, this driver deserves this, sends the wrong message, doesn't it, really? Like, you're trying to be totally impartial, and yet you as a steward are admitting that you think this guy deserves the championship. You are admitting, like, whatever you think from top to bottom, that could be somewhat problematic, right? But I think maybe the bigger deal is like how this has happened. And the drama for me is like why it's different this time than it was previously with Johnny Herbert, right? So the reason why this is controversial, it was the same thing with Johnny Herbert as well, is that he's given these comments to a PR agency that then reaches out to media outlets offering the quotes on the condition that they source this gambling website in exchange for the quotes. So that's kind of like the whole deal here, right? Is that Johnny Herbert, Derek Warwick, they give their quotes, maybe they get a bit of money in exchange, and then the gambling company then via a PR agency goes to the media and says, okay, here are the quotes. But it's not like the interview gets published anyway. It's not like there's this big interview that, a publication has. Everything is kind of behind the scenes. There's no real Warwick interview that can be found. The content just comes out as and when it is. So, it's an interesting business model anyway. But the fact that this happened before and now it's happening again is pretty controversial. I mean, as you can see here, these deals can pay interviewees up to 30,000 euros per year. So typically, as you might expect, they're getting paid for participating here, and Warwick is involved again where Johnny Herbert was previously. So, maybe this shouldn't come as a massive surprise. I think what comes as a surprise to me is that, okay, he's been suspended for one race weekend, whereas Johnny Herbert was just, fired, right, from his position as a result. So, I'm not exactly sure why or what the differences are or what you guys think about it in the comments section below. But, yeah, it's definitely an interesting development, right, that Derek Warwick's been suspended for only one race weekend. Could have been worse, potentially would have been the implication there. But I will say the reaction to it is pretty remarkable. Karun Chandok says, this is a shame and is a bit confusing, as Derek's comments that I read a few days ago were that he agrees with the steward's decision. But I think it might be the Hamilton comments, and it might simply be the way in which this has been happening, right? Like, if you're getting paid to give comments about certain drivers that may potentially compromise your position as a pundit, and then those comments are coming out to the media in kind of roundabout ways, it's maybe not the best look of all time. But I will say that Martin Brundle, look, Derek Warwick's obviously a friend of his and was banned for a race weekend as a steward, right? It's maybe not the biggest deal ever, right? Obviously it's controversial, but it's maybe, not the end of the world. But Brundle comes out with quite an impassioned remark, actually. It was a nice thing to say, but, controversial, I would say as well. Brundle says, Derek Warwick is one of the most genuine and passionate people and racers that I have ever known. He is a salt of the earth, genuine guy. He's done so much for young racers and motorsport in general, not least as an FIA steward. He has my absolute support and friendship until my last breath. So, quite the impassioned statement from Brundle as well. And obviously Brundle seems to believe, salt of the earth guy, that he would not make decisions, let's say, that were based in, some level of bias. But equally in this case, given what happened to Herbert before and the clear dynamics in play that the stewards surely know that this type of stuff is not necessarily on, that clearly, this is something which is kind of indefensible, really. And I think Warwick recognises that as well, but Brundle obviously wants to give his support too. I will say, just before we close out the video, one other thing that Brundle had to say was on Max Verstappen and his potential race ban / penalty points, whatever's going to happen in the near future. Because Brundle said that if you're as a Mercedes, if you're a McLaren, a Ferrari driver, maybe especially a McLaren driver in the championship fight, I would be goading him to get those extra points, because subconsciously he knows that he needs to be a touch more careful. So maybe that's kind of true, right? When you race Max this weekend and next weekend, the upcoming races, maybe you can be a bit more aggressive than you would otherwise normally expect to be able to be against Max, because you know that he's going to have to chill out just that little bit. But intriguing to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Is that going to work, right? Could he push Max around in this way? Maybe, maybe not. Pretty much when this video goes live, by the way, Le Mans will just about have got underway for the 24 hours. This is the wet car that was unveiled today in Le Mans for McLaren. Of course, they're going to come in a couple of years' time. So thought that was pretty exciting. And just to close out with, based on yesterday, these are the simulation data results. We had McLaren on race sims kind of at the top. Red Bull, Mercedes weren't far off either. Look, these numbers are never real, let's be honest, but they're probably about right this time. The quali sim looks really difficult to call between the top teams, although I will say that Red Bull are very hard to place after yesterday because the second session wasn't quite as strong. And then in race simulation data, it was all pretty competitive between everyone. In fact, maybe Russell was even the most impressive there, and the long run data from him was pretty good, but there was a bit of degradation as we've seen elsewhere as well. So it's going to be a fascinating day. The temperatures will play some part to play in it as well. I'm going to head to the track in a few minutes here. Very much interested to your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.